Hey folks, this is Jake from So We Flow, and you're listening to the Why We Move podcast. Join me as I speak with incredible movers from diverse disciplines to share their stories and give you practical and inspirational advice on movement and living a happy, healthy life. Whether you're a beginner or an expert, a fanatic or casual, these conversations are for anyone passionate about movement, their minds and their bodies.
First off, thank you, mate. I appreciate you having me here, and also for the kind words. I'm always grateful when how I'm trying to do things like translates and it actually comes across, because my whole mission with all of my work around breathwork is about accessibility. It's about just trying to appeal to myself 4 years ago and try and actually put it out in a way that will connect with someone who maybe traditionally wouldn't connect with breathwork. So my journey into it was really through my own experiences with my mental health, but also with breathwork. So I went through a really difficult period. Well, I say a difficult period, a long period of about 10 years of really struggling with anxiety, struggling with depression. And towards the end of that period, and this was about 4 years ago, 3.5, 4 years ago, I was having a really tough time with panic attacks, nearly like daily, if not a couple of times a day. And it was starting to really take control of my life. And I was still, by all means, pretty high functioning. Like I still had a decent job, I had, a load of mates. I was training a lot. I was moving a lot. I was going out, like all of the stuff that you'd expect to do, but I was still kind of living a lie in a way in terms of what I was struggling with and not really talking about it. And I hit what I always sort of refer to as my lowest point at the back end of 2018, and just went on this mission to find some stuff that would help me, to find some stuff that would work for me. I got very into yoga, meditation, like primal flow, different kinds of movement. I got a long background in sport, so I've always been fit and healthy, but I'd never really moved for the enjoyment of it. And so got into that, and then I was going to a studio in Fulham where I lived at the time, and Christian, the guy that runs the studio, was like, "Oh, why don't you stick around after primal for breathwork?" And I was like, "What's that? Like, what is it?" I'd never heard of it. I didn't know much about it. And I just thought, and it's not a term I like using a lot, but it just felt a little bit woo-woo to me at that point. I was like, I'm not sure I can engage with this. And I was very skeptical. I'm naturally pretty skeptical. And I didn't go. And then he said it to me again. And I was like, okay, all right, like I trust him. I'm going to give it a crack. And just really, there was something in it that made me stick with it. And then I carried on probably practicing a couple of times a week, and then got more and more into it and just started having some amazing experiences with it, and sort of deep transformative experiences. But also like the day-to-day side of it was a massive, massive benefit for me, because I was able to understand and tap into how I could use my breath to manage my triggers, manage my responses, manage how I was reacting to things. And as someone who struggled for so long with anxiety and panic attacks, that was a bit of a revelation to be like, oh, I can actually limit how strongly I feel about this thing that would normally take over my mind and take over my thoughts. So that was kind of the real route into it. I had one session in particular that really just blew my mind, and I've sort of had almost verging on like a psychedelic type experience that showed me, really in a weird way, sort of showed me bliss, showed me happiness that I hadn't felt in my life since I was a kid. And it just reminded me of what was possible. And I was like, all right, well, let's try and recreate that for myself without, needing to go an hour into a breathwork session. But also it just made me want to share it with other people. And I just felt very compelled to dive into it, to learn everything I could about it and equip myself to share it with other people. So that's really where it all started. And then ever since, as I kind of touched on at the start, it's been about making it real, about making it accessible, about making it, it's always going to be a spiritual practice, and I am a spiritual person, but I don't think we need to alienate people. And I think we can actually work harder to be more inclusive when it comes to spiritual practices. And so that's sort of the gap that I try and bridge in my work, is trying to say, it might seem a bit far-fetched, but if you give it a try, it could be massively beneficial. And I'm starting to look more into the science and the research behind it as well, to try and bring that to the conversation, so that people who are naturally more skeptical, like I was those years ago, have more of an appetite to engage with it. So yeah, that's kind of where it's come from and where it's at the moment.
Incredible, man. Thanks so much for sharing. I mean, I've got so many questions. I didn't want to interrupt you, but we'll see how we get on. But on your latter point there about kind of spirituality and the connection with that, how do you see and potentially separate the very practical side of it? Like, there is obviously a tangible physical effect on us when we do breath work, compared to the spiritual side. And do you feel, say, a perspective might be that spiritual side of it actually came from a lack of understanding of the actual physical, like the scientific interpretation? And do you think that's true, or what's your interpretation of that?
Yeah, it's a question I'm kind of grappling with a lot at the moment, as I start to go more into the research side of it, because I think, if we think about the sort of original schools of deeper breathwork, holotropic breathwork and rebirthing breathwork, they both really came from pretty, obviously holotropic came from the psychedelic realm with Stan Grof, but they both come from spiritual backgrounds rather than scientific backgrounds. And I know, or I think I know, I don't want to speak for him, but if I went and told my sort of mentor who I trained with that I was going to look at like the neuroscience of breathwork, he'd probably be like, why do you need to? Like, we know from how we feel it and the anecdotal evidence that we see in everyone that we work with that this works. We don't need to really understand the why and the how. And I do agree with that to an extent. And I think there's a real temptation in the West to always want that sort of explanation, always want to know the nuts and bolts of it, when I think a lot of, the essence of spirituality is the fact that it is indescribable, unknowable, super conscious, above what, normal waking consciousness can understand. So I do get that sort of, that just not feeling the need to have to understand exactly how it's working and what's going on. I think what we're seeing now, and I think this is why it's becoming more important, is that, any practice, any modality that has any level of credibility has a weight of research behind it. And I think that's what concerns me to an extent with this sort of explosion in popularity of breathwork is, there's really great research on the sort of functional breathing, oxygen advantage, even to a degree like Wim Hof method stuff. There's a decent bank of evidence there. But when it comes to the more spiritual end of the practice scale, where we're talking sort of the deeper healing modalities of breathwork, there's not. And because it's become so popular, people are going to start to ask questions, and they already are. And they're going to start to doubt it because there's not this weight of evidence. So I do think there's a certain level of modernization that needs to be brought to it to leave that credibility and also ensure the longevity of it. Like, we want to make sure this stuff sticks around, because as practitioners, we do know that it works even without the evidence. So I think that's going to be really important, just to make sure that it does stick around and it does have the impact that it could have. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question, mate, but I think there's this kind of like,
I think,
yeah, this kind of, yeah, go ahead.
I think end of the day, and, I'm sure people disagree with this, but given what we know about the world we live in today, I think every single type of practice, whatever it is, has some kind of practical scientific explanation behind it, right? And whether you want to know that or not, does it matter? Who cares, right? And just to kind of throw a converse out of there, what you said about, so your mentor would be like, why would you want to know? I think on the other side of the fence, there's also people that kind of look down on the scientific side because, I don't know, it's almost like a purposeful ignorance in a way. Like fair dues if you don't care because you just want to feel, but looking down on people for wanting to know that, I find is something so common in like the movie industry, particularly in the styles that are rooted in kind of like more spirituality, which is obviously arguable as well if with the history of yoga and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it is kind of something that's so prominent in our industries, right? It is this idea of if you are on the spiritual side of the fence, like you almost look down on the scientific side. But at the end of the day, who cares, right? If whoever you can traverse both those areas, and as long as it's bringing benefit to you and other people, like what does it really matter?
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, and it works in both directions because you get the science crowd looking down on the spirituality crowd and just going, "Oh, they're just woo-woo," right? So that's what I think. I always, whenever I talk on any podcast, somehow end up talking about social media. But social media is a very good example of just that polarity and the fact that you have to be one or the other, and it doesn't leave the space for you to have one foot in both worlds. And I think, for me, that's where I'm very conscious, very careful of how I talk about this stuff, because I love science. I love the brain. I love neuroscience. I love all of that stuff. And I love spirituality and the just pure acceptance. There's things we do not know and things bigger than us that we'll never understand.
Yeah.
But you can have both. And I just want to make sure that I'm always respectful to the roots of these practices and actually maintaining the integrity of that, whilst also saying, okay, I respect that, I accept it, I understand it. However, for me as an individual, I want to understand beyond that. I want to know what's going on, both for myself, but also so that we can make this even more impactful, so that we can capture a new demographic, so that we can capture a new crowd of people who go, oh, it's not for me, I don't get it. And if someone can say, well, actually, when you do this style of breath work, this happens in the brain, which allows you to tap into this, which allows you to heal this, or whatever it might be. And they go, okay, great, I'll give it a try. And that's all you just have to get someone in the room, because as anyone who's had an experience with breath work will likely know, is once you feel it, you accept that, okay, there's things going on here, whether you understand them or not. So yeah, I just think and this is all personal to me, right? It's just, I feel drawn to give more people a better understanding so that we can make it more accessible, because I don't think the benefits of these practices should be limited to only people that can engage with the deep spiritual side of it.
Absolutely. So I think this is probably a good point for you to explain to people listening, what is breathwork to you in a nutshell?
Yeah, well, we rewind and we can cover that bit. Yeah. So I toy with this definition and this explanation all the time, but like the very simplest basic level, it's any way we can use our breath to change how we feel physically, mentally, or emotionally. So that's the kind of the elevator pitch. Then within that, there's a spectrum, and we've kind of touched on it when we're talking about science versus spirituality, because there is this spectrum of practices, some that sit at one end, some that sit very heavily at the other end, and some that sit somewhere in the middle. And the best way, I borrow this acronym from a practitioner and a medical doctor called Ela Manga, who's brilliant, and she uses this acronym ART. So she talks about the art of breathwork. So ART, awareness, regulation, and transformation. So those are like the three pillars of breathwork. So first, you've got the awareness piece, which is how are you breathing right now in this moment, day to day, at rest, during exercise, during sleep, and also tapping into just pure breath awareness as a meditative practice. So actually learning how you breathe noticing that, becoming more conscious of that, and learning what that means in the context of your nervous system, in the context of how you feel, how you perform during exercise, how you sleep, and also just kind of your mental and emotional health as well. So that's really the foundation, is just being like more conscious of your breath and learning to understand what it means. Once you've got that foundation, the regulation piece, which is how can you consciously regulate, consciously change your breathing to achieve a shift in state? So how can you tap into your breath as this direct line, this direct key into your nervous system to either slow things down, balance things out, speed things up, and just using it. There's a guy called Jamie Wheel who talks about your breath as either the accelerator or the brakes of your nervous system. So you've got these options that you can say, okay, I'm going to do a slower, something like cadence breathing, which is in for 3, hold for 3, out for 6, hold for 3. And that is about down regulating, like down shifting, slowing everything down, calming, relaxing, sleep, whatever it might be. And then you've got more energizing practices like breath of fire. Wim Hof probably falls into this category as well, which are about, turning up the intensity, finding energy, focus, flow, boosting your immune response. So you've got all of these options. Once you've learned how to understand your breath, you can then tap into how you can change it and use it to influence and manipulate how you feel. And then you've got the T, which is where we're starting to get more into the spirituality of it, which is transformation. So looking at these deeper healing modalities of breath work that allow us to tap into our emotional body, access altered states of consciousness. And really, for me, this style of breath work is what I fell in love with. I find the sort of nuts and bolts of it very interesting, but the transformational stuff is really what changed the game for me. And it works really on 3 levels of healing, connection, and growth. So healing in the sense that we can work with trauma, adverse experiences that are held in the body, and look at how we can use the breath to clear and process that. Connection both to yourself, you're actually able to sort of foster a deeper connection to self, but also connection to people around you, both in the context of a group session, but also just the people in your life more broadly. And then the third one was growth. So actually just opening yourself up, sort of like I described in that session, I sort of tapped into something that I had never felt before, never experienced before, or certainly hadn't experienced for a long time. And you're able to sort of gain these insights and these experiences that you can't get from normal waking consciousness. Mm-hmm. And there's a great quote that I always come back to, which is super simple. It's, you have to go there to know there. And so you have to create situations where you can experience this thing, this state. And then you come back to normal life and you're like, oh, okay, now I understand like how I can bring more of that into my life day to day. So yeah, breathwork is extremely simple, but extremely complicated at the same time. But that is how I would explain it. And I'm pretty pleased with that explanation.
I thought it was thorough. It started with a nice sort of opening line, and then we dove a bit deeper, right?
We went in, yeah.
So obviously, like we've talked briefly about, a lot of these practices have come from the past, from like spiritual, like ancient civilizations. Would that be a correct assumption? Lots of them anyway. But going back even further than say ancient civilizations, they obviously discovered that we could use the breath to create these states of being. But I hope you've never been asked this question. I wonder if there's a question about breath that you haven't been asked, but what's your perception of why we can access these states through our breath? Like, why do you think we evolved to be able to go into those places, regardless of like ancient humans discovering them? Like,
that is a question I've never been asked, and it's a big, chunky question. So, oh God, why are these states possible? Getting into the realms of
that's when science starts to go like, what?
Well out the window. Yeah, exactly. So I think checking out of my scientific brain for a second, I think for me, I know it's actually now a myth, but, we always used to throw around this, that stat, I think, growing up, that we only use something like 20% of our brains. And it's been proven not to be true. But I think what that was initially probably getting at was the fact that so much of our being, so much of our experience lives in our subconscious mind and lives in our body consciousness and lives in something beyond what is essentially our prefrontal cortex and a couple of other bits of our brain, which is that sort of monkey mind, that rational thought, that ego. And for me, what we see, I have a deep interest and sort of fascination with psychedelics as well. And I think we're talking about a lot of the same things when we talk about breathwork in a deeper sense, and altered states that you can achieve through psychedelics and plant medicine. And I think the reason is probably to give us the opportunity to go beyond that normal waking state. And I think that is where things get really interesting. It's where we start to understand and really strip back, everything that gets imprinted on your prefrontal cortex. So conditioning, judgment, ego, trauma, everything that really brings us kind of down, and things that are unavoidable, but things that really block us. And so there feels to me like there's something in these modalities, in these altered states, that is saying, I heard a great analogy for psychedelics the other day, which is the experience will take you to the top of Mount Everest, and then it will shove you back to the bottom. But when you get back to the bottom, there'll be a ladder there. So it's not saying that it's going to take you there, and when you come back, you'll still be at the top, knowing everything you need to know. Mm-hmm. It shows you the work that needs to be done, and then gives you the opportunity to put it into practice. So it comes back to that idea of, going there to know there. And so, yeah, it's such an amazing question, because we'll never know. But at the same time, it's nice to think about, it's nice to actually think that there's more to it than just sort of being a meat sack carrying around a brain, and to think that there's something a little bit beyond just this normal waking state. And that's what I find really fascinating, is some of the shared experiences that people have on both breathwork journeys, but also psychedelics, as people start seeing the same things, the same visuals. And that to me makes no sense, but in like a really beautiful way, to be like, there's a little bit more here than I think we realize.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're such complex beings that it could purely just be a coincidence that those states are possible. And it could be we use those states for other reasons, and we're just like bypassing certain, I don't even know what they are, but connections to get there through our breath or whatever else. And it could just be a coincidence, or maybe there is more to it. And I think it's hard to not feel like we do live our lives kind of like surface all the time. I'm in no way any kind of like breathwork expert, or I've had my fair share of experiences, my experiences with psychedelics for sure, in the past. But I still feel like I really do live my life on this surface level. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you do get these glimmers of moments where you dive in and you just think there's something more to this. And you can get it from so many different things. You could get it from, I think the thing that I get it the most often from is when I'm surfing, right? And it's rarely, and it's just being out on my board and just seeing the sky and the sea, and it takes you almost like nothing else matters, and you just go into this more like primal state, for want of a better way of saying it. And I think it can happen like when you practice yoga, when you do breath work, when you do any kind of exercise. I think it can take you there. But also, I mean, even drinking, I think like the state where the everyday person probably goes into it the most, like most commonly, is maybe on like a night out. Like you go into this deeper state than just about like of everyday life, basically.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. Absolutely. I think I was, as you were about to say surfing, I was like, I think he's going to say surfing, because it's definitely the same for me. And I know, that's why there's surf therapy retreats, right? They use it for PTSD and veterans in the States. It is like, it's very therapeutic in nature because of that state of deep presence. And, we talk about flow states as this intersection of discipline and surrender. So it's like this deep focus on, not getting completely buried by a wave, and also just letting yourself go to the experience. And I think that's where we start to find this real focused presence. And the other thing that I was thinking as well, it's something that I've read about quite a lot, is this idea that as humans on this planet, where we don't really know if there's anything beyond the here and now, we've always sought out things to attach ourselves to in terms of meaning, whether it's religion, whether it is spirituality, whether it is, it's why people fall into cults, because it's like a real deep sense of meaning and hope and connection. And so we're always looking for those things. And I used to be really, really critical of religion. Like, I was a staunch atheist and I didn't get it. And I thought it was a really negative thing. And there are negative parts of it. I don't doubt that. But also, now that I find myself much more spiritual as an individual, a lot of the language that I find myself using is akin to how religious people describe their religion and their faith, because it's faith, right? It's faith in something beyond yourself. And that striving for meaning, I think, is potentially a big part of these altered states, because we get a glimpse of it. We get a glimpse of, like, I know now that there is something beyond just what I feel day to day. And so I can attach to that. I can hold on to that experience and be like, okay, that gives me, in a way, not in sort of a dramatic way, it gives me something to live for and gives me something to believe in. Because I think it would be pretty, that's how people fall into that sense of existential dread when they're like, I am just a monkey with a brain who's lucky enough to be able to speak and write. And so I think it matters so much for us to have meaning in our lives. And I think that's where altered states can play quite an important part.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I think it is, I was similar to you, I guess, in the sense, like, I was a pretty staunch atheist as well. And I guess I still am to a degree. But I would say that it's easy to brush off things that are unexplainable or like spiritual or whatever else with just the kind of thing, the mindset of there is no meaning. Like, we're just here to reproduce. But there is a beauty in considering at least the fact that we don't have these thoughts and the accessibility to thoughts and spaces in our brains and how we feel for just no good reason, right? And I guess we right now, like, it doesn't feel like we'll ever really know why. But things change. But I think just to go back to surfing, like, that's one of the things that reminds me that maybe there is something more. And like I said, it's not actually surfing. It's more just usually when you're like lying out on your board, like glassy water, the sky, like some flying around, and it's quiet, and you just have this like inner connection. Do you think civilizations that use breathwork were in that state, in sort of so we talked about this level state, right, that most of us seem to live in. Do you think they were further down into deeper states more often because they didn't have jobs, they didn't have like screens, social media, all the worries about money, right? They were worrying about like things, survival, right? They were worrying about hunting, they were worrying about shelter, foraging, and they were always outside in the world, interacting with the world. And do you think, regardless of breath, we've kind of gone a bit off topic, but do you think they were in a deeper state more often?
Yeah, I do, is probably the simple answer. I think everything, about modern society and especially Western civilization it really seems to go at odds to how our nervous systems and how our brains were created to function. I think that's why we see such high rates of anxiety, depression, stress is such a, it's a chronic problem, because I think, if we're thinking tribal cultures, ancient civilizations, they would have had stressors. That's why we have a stress response, is to respond to stressors. But they would have been so much more fluid, and their nervous system fires up to fight or run, or like do something that requires that. And then they would go back to doing what they were doing before and relaxing. And they didn't just have these constant stimuli like pelting their brain. Like Russell Brand talked about it as culture having jump leads on his consciousness, because there's just so much coming in from all angles, whether it's a meeting, whether it's a call, whether it's an argument, whether it's late for a train, late for a bus, whatever it might be, all of these tiny little stresses that just cause us overwhelming issues. And so I do think they would have naturally just been in a much more present state. I think our society is designed for us not to be present. I think even, the fact that I was writing about it the other day, this sort of journey back to human, and how there's this huge rise in what are ultimately very simple modalities, like getting in cold water, breathing fast or breathing slow, spending time in nature with your shoes off. So we are regressing, but in a really healthy way. We're going back to things that are so simple, but it's because it's a very much like a countercultural response to say we are tired of the complexity and the noise. So we're going to strip it back to the basics and get back to what feels good to our system, which is, cold, which is breath, which is moving. And I think that's why we're seeing and I love what you guys are all about, because the style of movement, like I know CJ pretty well, and I love just watching that guy move, because it's so fluid and it's so natural and so, like human in its essence. And I think that's why we're seeing so much of a rise in this kind of work, because people are bored of sitting in front of Netflix and feeling like a zombie all the time. And we're getting more and more glimpses of these experiences. And once you have a taste of it, that's why surfing, as much as you can suck as a beginner for a very long time, is so addictive, because you get a glimpse where you catch a wave and you're like, oh my God, that was literally incredible. I need more of that. And you can chase it, and you can sort of get this desire. But I think if you're chasing feelings like that, you're in a pretty good place.
For sure. And I think that, like, the complexities of life, which you mentioned, of day-to-day life, for even the most relaxed person, that life is complex, right? And it's exhausting, overwhelming. And it takes walking into the middle of a wood, like climbing up a mountain, walking into a massive field, or paddling a mile out, to actually find that sense. Even like I feel I live a fairly laid back life, but I don't really feel relaxed until I put myself in those places. And even what you talked about, obviously the rise of kind of more natural and fluid, uninhibited movement disciplines. And yeah, I completely agree. One of the reasons they've become so popular is because it's exhausting to put everything in a box all the time as well. Like, we have to label everything, and ironically, I'm going to say we have to explain everything, because we were kind of talked about that at the start. But it can be exhausting to do it, rather than to just actually do it because of how it feels inside you, rather than, I mean, we're all guilty of it, right? Myself included, probably every day. Like, we do, even our practices we do for our identity to other people. We do it for how we look to other people. And we don't always, we go in and out of doing it for ourselves, but it's not always 100% true to just how we feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I was chatting on a panel the other day about exercise and mental health. And one of the big things that came up was around this idea of like finding your why when it comes to exercise, and shifting from, external validation, external locus of control, training because you think you should, or training because you think you should be fitter or skinnier or whatever it might be. If you're doing it for anyone other than yourself, then that's not a good place to start. And if you're doing it because it makes you feel good, if you're doing it because it makes you happy, if you're doing it for longevity or to push yourself out of your comfort zone, that to me is what we're seeing more of a move towards. But it's still, our society as well is designed and geared up for constant comparison. So it also then becomes tough when you are seeing people doing things that you might feel you should do. Then it then becomes difficult just to tap back into, I'm doing this for me. I'm doing this because I feel good. I'm doing this because it makes me happy. And it's really hard. And, I fall into it myself, right? Like it's not an easy thing to do, but it's something you just have to practice and practice and practice as to, what are you training for? Who are you training for? Any activity, training or otherwise, like why are you doing it? Are you doing it for yourself, or are you doing it for an external reason?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think stripping that, even in exercise, I'm kind of done with the word exercise, and I have been for a while, because it insinuates like a struggle, and it insinuates like I guess like no enjoyment, and for like a really specific purpose. And obviously goals are good, like training towards goals are good if they're for the right reasons. But yeah, I mean, it's even been proven, right? Like in science, that exercise isn't really even that good for like so whatever else, right? You're better just not being sedentary. That's the best thing you can do for your body, for everything really, for weight maintenance, for all the processes that happen inside your body. And I see so many people out there that are struggling like with this like yo-yo dieting, yo-yo exercise plans, when really all they just need to do is connect with themselves a little bit more and just move more throughout the day. They don't have to kill themselves like every single day. And in fact, the stress response from that is actually pretty damaging on the body from doing really intense like cardio work or on a regular basis. And yeah, knowing why we move and why we want to do it and the purpose when it's for ourselves is one of the most important things you can kind of discover. I know it was a revelation for me when I kind of one day realized I'm really just doing what I want to do right now. Like I've got no motive outside of like just wanting to do it for myself because it feels good and I just wholeheartedly enjoy what I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. I think that's something I've really come to as well. And it's not to say that because I think some people would almost confuse that with not laziness, but almost you're giving yourself easy ways out. If you're not, no days off and you're not going hard every single day, but it's not about that. Like you can still challenge yourself, you can still push yourself, but it's for you. It's proving it to yourself rather than proving it to other people, and still doing it for the love of it, and having this, having a routine that is baggy enough to live in, to like flexible enough that you can like move within it to say, okay, you know what, I don't feel like doing that today, but instead I'm going to do this. And, just having these options that you can work with. And it's the same with any kind of practice, movement, breathwork, meditation, whatever it might be. Like you just get better at listening to yourself. And that's where I think self-awareness becomes such a key factor. Is like you learn about your brain and yourself so much that you know what's right and what's wrong without, listening to your smartwatch or listening to your Whoop band or whatever it might be to tell you, when to train and how to train. Data's important and powerful, but if you actually have that inner compass dialed in, you can really figure out, what is right for you on any given day.
Yeah. And taking the pressure off is something I've struggled with for a long time, and I've really only found sort of a pace of equilibrium with it now, in terms of not being too hard on myself and trusting my instinct to make the right choice for my body and my mind in the moment. And it's such a hard notion to get across to, say, someone that's never looked after themselves and they're looking to make that step, because how can you prescribe sort of 80% effort to someone that's to actually make that percent effort from the start. It's very hard, and I think that's why the popularity of these like excessive exercise plans, it's part of the reason. It's like you get promised short-term results and you go 100% because people just yearn for that black and white perspective, but the gray area is really the sweet spot. And I think once you're up and running, you should be looking for that gray area of your practice. Like you say, having that flexibility. When you described that, I was thinking of just like a bag, I don't know why, but a bag of marbles in kind of like a lid, just kind of like moving around.
Yeah.
And having freedom within the structure as well. Like you need a base structure, right? But having freedom within it is a bit of an art form, to be honest, especially for someone, I'm sure you said you've got sports back, someone that has grown up with that kind of more regimented approach, to be able to give themselves that freedom within the space it's really challenging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're right. This is why it's such a difficult conversation to have, because, the two of my favorite quotes almost contradict each other. There's one which is from like an ex-Navy SEAL, and he just says discipline equals freedom. And I agree, like having structure and discipline does allow you to live a freer life. But at the same time, the other one is that one around having a routine baggy enough to live in. So it's finding, as you said, like that gray of, I know my structures, I know my rhythms, I know my routine, but I know when that's not right on a given day. And so actually allowing yourself, and it's a constant battle. And also, as you said, like if someone's really starting from scratch, what's the right level for them to actually get them to a point where they can do that, and making sure that they're healthy and they've ensured longevity and they're looking after their body. And actually sometimes a harder push might be necessary to begin, but then you can start to put into place more flexible structures. So yeah, it's a very difficult conversation to have in a world that loves that black and white.
Yeah. And I think, that first quote you said, that, what was it? Discipline equals freedom. I've really experienced how discipline and structure have helped my life, like by having a child. And we envisaged this romantic notion of having this kind of feral child that we'd have no rules, like no routine, but it is literally chaos. Like, and that quote could not be more true for me, in the sense of giving Axel like a structured day just gives us complete freedom in so many ways. But the sort of the other side of it is that I think you can go through your day without being mindful of what you're doing if it's too structured, right? Because even like in a movement practice, if I do this practice on a Monday at 7 p.m, you can almost do it without thinking about it. And I think having that awareness is really important, to have that within a structure if you are going to go down this super structured route in your life. But obviously some elements we have the structure, so we don't have to use our energy on the awareness, but other elements, it's actually a detriment to lose that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as well, it's about having structure whilst maintaining an open mind, because I think heavily structured environments can really easily create like a very fixed mindset of I go here at this time, I do this, I go through these motions. And as you said, you lose that curiosity, that mindful element, be it movement or anything else. And if you're just doing something for the sake of doing it rather than for, the intention behind it, or just for the love of it, then you start to lose that sort of that wonder, that childlike wonder, and that novelty of it, and that enjoyment of it, if you get too fixed. So yeah, my girlfriend and I are 3 weeks into a new puppy, and we've definitely found the same as you with your boy, because that it couldn't be more true for us as well. Like we were just like, yeah, it'll be easy, like I'll be fine, we'll just go with the flow. And then we've put in a really like structured routine to make our lives easier, to make Lara's life easier. Like everything around that is true, but also maintaining that ability to kind of flow in and out of it as well.
Yeah, fluidity is super important, especially when it comes to like like your movement and your nutrition or whatever else, because life changes, right? And we do pass through days where things are the same, but what are you how are you negatively impacting your health, your physical or your mental health by too strict into that structure? For example, this morning, like I've got yoga in my instruction, but no, I can't go surfing because I've got to do my yoga. Like, what are you doing to yourself by having those restrictions? Or maybe, your wife and your kid, they want to go out for a walk and you're like, oh no, doing my workout. Or what are you're jeopardizing those moments, and that is like feeling guilty for missing it or whatever else, right? And that guilt is unhealthy in itself. So you might be improving your health by doing those things, but you're also damaging your mental health by carrying guilt with the things you do day by day. And I think that's one of the major causes for people stopping doing good themselves, is because they feel those emotions are connected to those things so tightly and intimately that if it fails, then it's almost like, oh, well, what's the point, kind of thing.
Definitely. Yeah. I think people put a lot of pressure on themselves, and that causes infinite stress to be one thing or the other, or to keep doing something if it's, they think it's good for them, but actually it's doing harm in other areas of their life. I think, yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's kind of, I was actually looking at this yesterday, and it's like the kind of, it's like frequency adverbs. So it starts from like whatever, unlikely, and the top is like always, and then there's like sometimes, often, frequently, consistently, all these words in between, and they all have like really subtly different meanings. And I think it's about, say, consistency is something that's regular, but like the time in between doesn't necessarily matter. So frequently might be with short space of time, but consistently is more like the difference it's variable, right? Other than the fact that it's done often over a long period of time. And I think the key to like vibrant health is consistency rather than necessarily frequency, right? It's just making good choices for yourself often, regularly, over a long period of time.
Yeah. And there's it's from a book. What's the book? Atomic Habits. And he talks about identity-based habits, and basically this is how you actually hit home and make a habit stick, is when you become a person who does a thing, when you actually identify as, I am someone who does yoga, rather than, oh, I've got to do yoga today. And it's that shift from trying or like pushing yourself to do something, actually being like, I like this, so I'm going to do it. And like for me, I now, and that's where the consistency element comes in, because that's how it becomes consistent. Because when you then have the opportunity to do that thing, you want to do it, so you do it. And that for me, like, I don't surf often, but when I have the opportunity to, I do it. So I'd say I surf relatively consistently, but probably over quite long periods of, gaps in between. And I'm not very good either. But if someone asks if I surf, I'll say, yeah. And they'll be like, oh, you must be pretty good. I'll be like, no, but I love it. And I think that's the thing. So it's like finding this balance between, as you said, like everyone's time periods of these things are so different, but it's about, can you become someone who loves that thing and does that thing for the enjoyment of it, because that's where it starts to stick. I really like that.
That's awesome. So I was just like thinking maybe we'll bring some breathwork back into it now. So I've dabbled in breathwork in and out. I did kind of Wim Hof training courses, and every time I've loved the experiences. And obviously I get breathing experiences from my yoga practice, and I'm trying to stay conscious of my breath, but I've always struggled to have consistency, right, in terms of an actual breathwork practice on top of everything else. And so what's your kind of advice for introducing a breathwork practice to your life from your own experiences, especially as someone that was, I guess, skeptical would be a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It kind of comes back to that acronym of, awareness, regulation, transformation. And you can sort of join the breathwork train at any point along that acronym. Like my first experience was actually more of a transformational style experience, which then got me curious about breathing in its entirety and sort of the bigger picture of breathwork. What I would say to people who are curious but not sure where to start, for me, the actual, I've had these massive transformational experiences with the breath, which have helped me to no end, but they're a little bit less frequent. They're sort of more standout, like one-offs that you have maybe 2 or 3, 4 times a year, depending on how consistently you're practicing. And for me, the sort of biggest benefit has just been around this whole consciousness awareness of my breath, because I've now made it the first place I go whenever something feels slightly off. So if I feel like this morning, I was sat about half an hour before we started this going, I am exhausted. I have zero energy. And I sat with my girlfriend and she was like, just go do some, why don't you practice what you preach? Go do some breath work. I was like, shit, yeah, that's a really good idea. So I just went next door, did 3 rounds of Wim Hof, which is obviously slightly more like upregulating about energy and focus. Did a few breath holds with that and felt great afterwards. So it's sort of marrying up this awareness of your breath to say, oh, I don't feel quite right. And then you go, okay, how am I breathing? And that habit, that has to be quite a conscious thing to begin with, where you're like, oh, I don't feel good. Oh yeah, Jamie told me to check my breath. And then you do it. And then it becomes almost an unconscious habit where anytime something feels a bit funky, you can be like, what's going on with my breathing? And once you check in with it, not only have you distracted yourself from whatever funky thoughts are going on, but you've also given yourself an opportunity to change how you feel and take back a bit of agency, a bit of control. So that would be my, that would be my first advice: is your breath tells you so much about how you're feeling, and it also gives you so much power to change how you feel. So that would be like a really practical piece of advice. Anytime people feel a little bit off, a little bit tired, a little bit overstimulated, can't switch off, whatever it might be, check your breath and then look into ways that you can start to shift and change that. And there's a lot of us, kind of as an aside to that, there's a lot of us walking around with dysregulated nervous systems, which is just a fancy way of saying that we're either experiencing too much stress or we're feeling a bit stuck, a bit frozen, whatever it might be. And there's a really simple exercise that I would always kind of prescribe to people as a good place to start, which is something called coherent breathing or resonant breathing, which is, in an ideal world, the science, to come back to the science, is an inhale through the nose for 5.5 seconds and an exhale out of the nose for 5.5 seconds. But I just tell people to do in for 5, out for 5. And that, considering that our natural breathing rate for most of us is between 13 and 20 breaths per minute, that brings your breathing down to 6 breaths per minute. So you're massively reducing your breathing rate, so almost cutting it in half. And if you're breathing in that way, in and out of your nose and breathing with your diaphragm, with your belly, you are balancing and calming your nervous system and putting yourself just into a place of kind of centered, like you're very centered in that place. So that exercise, for 5 minutes in the morning when you wake up, 5 minutes before you go to bed, is a great place to start, just to give yourself the chance to start the day or finish the day from, neutral, rather than, revving up here in stress or way down here in, overtired. You can actually bring yourself back to a place of center. And then beyond that, for anybody who's curious around like the deeper work, is just find a practitioner that resonates with you. It might not be me. I'm sure for a lot of people it won't be me, but there are lots of us out there. And if someone resonates with you, speak to them, find a session. I'd always encourage people to find an in-person session rather than something online. I do teach online, but I'm doing less and less of it because it's not quite the same energy, not quite the same experience. And just give it a try. If you are skeptical, give it a try, because the physicality of the experience, people often get like tingling or sensations in the body. that for skeptics usually is enough for them to go, okay, there's something in this, because once you start to feel, that's a powerful thing. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to get started, but I'd make the breath that first port of call as like your internal check-in, your internal guidance mechanism, and then learn how you can implement different practices and different exercises to change how you feel. So yeah, that a relatively long answer to quite a simple question, but I think there's a few bits hopefully people can take from that.
Yeah, of course. Perfect. I think I'm really interested to kind of know what, from your knowledge, why does the breath have this impact on our state of mind, and why is there a connection?
So the role of the breath from a sort of basic state shifting mechanism comes back to our autonomic nervous system. So our autonomic nervous system governs all of the automatic functions in the body. So heart rate, digestion, metabolism, breathing, so on and so forth. But the breath is the only part of that system that we can consciously control. So everybody knows we can breathe without thinking about it, but we can also change our breath consciously and change how we're breathing. So it's unique in that sense because it allows us to influence where we sit in our nervous system. So we've talked a little bit already about sort of the speeding up and the slowing down, but broadly speaking, there's, a kind of deeper answer than this, but broadly speaking, I think for most people, what we need to understand about our nervous system is that we have two branches, which is the sympathetic, the fight flight, and the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest. We have the ability through our breath to move up or move down. So we can consciously slow things down, consciously move into relaxation, or consciously move into energy, focus, and stress, but stress in a positive sense if we're choosing to do it, using that stress response for good. So that's the kind of nuts and bolts of simply changing your breath, with a simple exercise like that coherent breathing to change how you feel. And then when we start getting into the deeper modalities of breath work, as we've touched on quite a bit, the science is emerging, the research is emerging, and it's new. Personally, and emphasis on personally, but there are people I know who share this belief. My theory, my hypothesis on what is going on in the brain when we get into deeper modalities of breath work is that we're decreasing the activity in something called the default mode network, which is a series of parts of our brain, including the prefrontal cortex, that essentially make up the ego mind, that make up the monkey mind. And we know from research into psychedelics that is what is going on with things like psilocybin. There's an actual down regulation of that part of the brain. And when that part of the brain gets quieter, it allows other parts of our brain to become more active, which is why we're able to tap into the subconscious. So my belief, and I'm hoping to be able to back this up at some point in the not too distant future, is that we are seeing very similar patterns in the brain between breathwork and psychedelics. So we're actually turning down the volume on that constant internal chatter, which allows so much interesting stuff that's going on in the background to come more into the foreground. So that's why my advice whenever I take people through a longer, deeper session is that, and people will say, what should I expect? And the answer is, we don't know, because all we're doing in these sessions is handing the keys over to our subconscious and handing the keys over to our body. So I can't tell you what you've got going on under the surface that is about to come to the surface. So for some people, it's very cathartic, it's very emotional. For other people, it's memories. For other people, it's trauma. For other people, it's much more psychedelic, much more visual. And so it's very, very difficult to say this is what you will experience. But that for me feels, from what I see when I work with people, feels like the best, theory at the moment as to what is going on. So there's, a lot more to be done in terms of substantiating that. But from a simple perspective, it's about changing where we sit within our nervous system. And from a deeper healing perspective, it's about connecting to the body consciousness and the subconscious mind.
Sure. I think that's really helped me, man. Thanks so much for explaining that way. I think it's, often the why we're doing something is the main thing, but I think the why can be quite daunting when it comes to breath work, and just visualizing it as kind of almost like a closed circle with like one point, and that's the breath. That's the thing we have control of this kind of like circle of activity that's happening inside our bodies. Visualizing it that way has really kind of opened it up for me, I guess, in a way. It's quite like a liberating notion that we have this place we can either just let do its own job, it can do the job itself, but we can also step in through this one door if we want to. And that kind of like really makes the whole idea simple, even though there is a complexity to it. And I don't think I think lots of people listening will see that as quite like an inspiring motion, really, in a way.
Yeah, I think that for me has been, it's given me a lot of purpose, a lot of, we talked about finding meaning, but I spent nigh on 10 years of my life feeling completely passive to my own mind, completely passive to my thoughts. So I was controlled by my triggers, controlled by anxious thoughts, intrusive thoughts. And all of a sudden I had this single key to influence that. And that's not to say, breathwork will solve all of your problems. I'm not that much of an evangelist and not that naive, but it has a good chance of really helping a lot of people. And, at the same time that I discovered breathwork, I was also in therapy. I was also learning more about myself and gaining that self-awareness. And I think these are all tools of, be it meditation, be it movement, be it therapy, be it breathwork. It's all tools of self-inquiry. It's all saying, what is actually going on? And once you know what's going on, it's kind of like that acronym, awareness and then regulation. You have to become aware before you can do anything about it. And so, yeah, it's a really powerful understanding to have, is that, this thing that is so simple, which is your breath, you can change a lot with on a simple level, but also on a deeper level. Like, it is perhaps, well, in my mind, definitely one of the most underestimated things, one of the most underestimated tools that we have at our disposal. And I think that's why we're starting to see such a rise and such a shift in people's acceptance and acknowledgement of it.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think going back to kind of what we said early on in the conversation about how complex modern life is, I think we tend to look for external solutions for how we feel, right? And I think most people out there know that it never really is the answer. And that's why people are starting to look within now. I know that sounds a bit of like sort of I'm sorry, it's like a cliche statement somewhere, but yeah, I think the answers are to do with processing what's going on with it inside us, introspection, rather than trying to solve how we feel with like external either items or situations or circumstances. And I think that's why it is becoming more popular, and these movement disciplines as well, and like yoga, mindfulness, meditation, is because we're realizing that these solutions that we were trying before just aren't working for us. And that's,
100%.
People in amazingly privileged circumstances as well. The people that would have access to any external solution if they wanted it, and not finding gratification, fulfillment, resolution in these external things. Yeah,
100%. I think that's why, so a random thought that just came into my head, but there are a lot of, quote unquote celebrities who are very into, be it meditation, be it breathwork, be it wellness more broadly. And it feels like they're the best example of, they quite literally could have, and probably in a lot of ways do have, any material thing that they could possibly want. Mm-hmm. And yet they are still looking for better ways and internal ways to look after themselves. And it probably just goes to show that, all the money in the world still won't solve patterns and behaviors that are ingrained. And if you're unconscious to them, then that's going to always cause problems regardless of, how big your house is.
Yeah. And we have everyone has this incredible tool, their breath, at their disposal, and they can access it whenever they want, right? And I think that's the beauty of it. You can literally be anywhere and use this amazing thing we have to alter how we feel and for the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that as well, for me, is something I really notice is when it comes to helping ourselves, we find either something is too complicated. I'm like, oh, I won't do that. That's too much. It's too complex. Or things are too simple. It's like, surely that can't be that impactful because it's so simple. And so we end up just not doing anything. Mm-hmm. And it is just breathing. That is feedback I get a lot. People saying, isn't it just breathing? I'm like, yes, but like there's so much more to it. And it's just, it's so exciting for me to see people getting more immersed in this work, because it's, for me, my barometer is always my parents and my friends from school, because these are people that I've known for a very, very long time. Obviously, know my parents for a decent amount of time. And if they're starting to ask questions and become more curious about this stuff, I know that something is starting to land, because those people in my life tend to be a little bit more skeptical when it comes to this stuff. So it really encourages me and excites me to see everyone getting a little bit more interested and a little bit more curious about this kind of work.
Yeah, sure. And it almost shows that the thing holding us back, us as a society, it has been society itself, right? And culture and cultural norms and what we think about others. And in fact, I've always been looking for that extra step or that extra depth or that solution. They've just never felt comfortable to explore it due to like social stigma or whatever else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, all of these introspective tools and modalities are about bringing you as an individual closer to who you are, because I think all of the conditioning, everything going on outside, can bring us away from that, because we fall into this trap of wanting to be what we think we should be. And if people can't already guess, I love myself a quote, but there's this great quote that is, the sources of our greatest suffering are the lies we tell ourselves. Mm-hmm. And every time, we stray further from who we really are, we feel that suffering more deeply. And breathwork, meditation, everything else that falls under this category of, introspective self-inquiry tools are about bringing us closer to that, showing us our true self, learning about our true self, so that you can embody that on a more regular basis and live a happier life.
Amazing, man. I think that's the perfect way to wrap it up. a nice strong monologue. Yeah. So honestly, Jeremy, thank you so much. It was an amazing conversation. Honestly, I've enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'd love to have you back on like in a few months, when you've gone a bit deeper into your science and we can get into some other areas, because I think we probably spent about 45 minutes of that talking about completely other topics, which is fine, but amazing. Is there anything you'd like to share with the listeners just before we finish up?
I guess if people want to reach out, I'm always happy to chat. I think that's probably the only thing, is just ways to contact me. The best place is Instagram. So it's at _breath_space on Instagram, or thebreathspace.co.uk is my website. So if anyone does want to chat, that's where to find me. And yeah, always happy to answer questions or tell people more about what they've heard today.